Nobody in the room realized they were about to ignore the most qualified person there. The dinner rush hit Whitmore Grand Steakhouse like a wave. Crystal glasses reflected warm golden light. Conversations blended with the soft sound of silverware and piano music. Every table was occupied. Every server moved quickly. Every manager watched the floor with practiced precision. It was the kind of evening that generated thousands of dollars every hour. Near the center of the restaurant, Billionaire CEO Daniel Whitmore sat with a group of investors discussing a major expansion project. The restaurant belonged to his hospitality company, but tonight he was there as a businessman, not an owner. He barely noticed the servers moving between tables. To him, they blended into the background of a successful operation. A few yards away, Jasmine Turner carried a tray loaded with drinks through the crowded dining room. At 29 years old, she had worked at the restaurant for nearly 3 years. Most customers remembered her smile. Few remembered her name. She moved with quiet confidence, greeting guests, refilling glasses, and helping new employees whenever the floor became chaotic. To most people, she was simply another waitress. Then the front doors opened. An older man stepped inside wearing a charcoal gray jacket and carrying a leather portfolio. He paused near the entrance and looked around the crowded restaurant. A hostess greeted him immediately with a welcoming smile. The man returned the smile politely, but did not speak. The hostess repeated herself. Still no answer. Her smile faded slightly. She tried again. The man reached into his pocket and removed a small card. Before he could show it, another guest approached the host's stand with a reservation question. The hostess became distracted. A second employee stepped in to help, but quickly encountered the same problem. The man pointed gently toward his ear and then shook his head. He was deaf. The employee nodded awkwardly. Unfortunately, that was where the communication ended. Around the busy entrance, uncertainty spread. One employee attempted to speak louder. Another pointed toward a menu. The visitor remained patient, but confusion continued to grow. Several guests waiting nearby began noticing the situation. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked uncomfortable. A few glanced away entirely. The older man stood quietly amid the noise, surrounded by people yet unable to communicate with any of them. Across the dining room, Daniel happened to glance toward the entrance. He noticed the small gathering but returned to his conversation. He assumed a manager would handle it. After all, that was what managers were paid to do. Near the host's stand, the situation became increasingly awkward. The visitor attempted to explain something through gestures, but nobody understood. One employee searched for a notepad. Another suggested using a phone translation app. Valuable minutes passed. The man's expression remained polite, but disappointment slowly appeared in his eyes. He had experienced moments like this before. Places that advertised hospitality often forgot accessibility. Eventually, he began reaching for the door. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply prepared to leave. And that was the moment Jasmine looked up from across the room. She noticed the gathering. She noticed the confusion. She noticed something everyone else had missed. Without hesitation, she placed her tray on a nearby service station and started walking toward the entrance. Nobody paid attention at first. After all, she was only a waitress. Nobody yet realized that within the next few moments, the entire restaurant would fall silent. Jasmine crossed the dining room without drawing attention to herself. The restaurant remained busy, filled with conversation and the clinking of glasses, yet a small pocket of silence seemed to surround the entrance. The deaf visitor still stood near the host's stand, holding his leather portfolio. The hostess looked embarrassed. The manager looked frustrated. Neither knew what to do next. Jasmine arrived beside them and offered a calm smile. The older man noticed her immediately. Unlike everyone else, she did not begin speaking. Instead, she gently raised one hand. Then she signed 4 simple words. Good evening. Welcome. How are you? The effect was instant. The visitor froze. His eyes widened. For a second, he simply stared at her. Then a smile slowly appeared across his face. A real smile. The kind that comes from relief rather than politeness. He responded immediately in American Sign Language. His hands moved quickly. Jasmine answered without hesitation. The conversation flowed naturally, effortlessly, like two people speaking their native language. Around them, confusion gave way to astonishment. The hostess blinked several times. The manager stared openly. Guests waiting near the entrance stopped checking their phones. Even a nearby server carrying drinks slowed down to watch. Within seconds, The awkward situation that nobody could solve had completely transformed. The visitor's posture changed. The disappointment that had settled into his expression disappeared. Jasmine asked about his reservation. He explained that he had one under the name Michael Reed. She nodded and confirmed it. Then she asked whether he preferred a quieter table due to the noise level in the dining room. Michael looked surprised again. He signed that very few restaurants had ever thought to ask. Jasmine smiled and assured him they could accommodate that request. Across the restaurant, Daniel Whitmore happened to glance toward the entrance once more. This time he noticed something unusual. The small crowd had not dispersed. In fact, more people seemed to be watching. Daniel paused his conversation with the investors. At first he assumed a customer complaint was unfolding. Then he saw Jasmine. Her hands moved confidently as she communicated with the guest. Daniel frowned slightly. He leaned back in his chair and continued observing. Near the entrance, the conversation continued. Michael signed something that made Jasmine laugh softly. She replied with a longer response. Several signs followed, then several more. The exchange was far beyond basic greetings. They were discussing details, preferences, and even small jokes. The manager looked increasingly stunned. He had worked with Jasmine for nearly 3 years and never knew she possessed this skill. Michael eventually signed a question. Jasmine answered. His expression changed immediately. Surprise. Then admiration. Then something deeper. Respect. He signed another question, longer this time. Jasmine responded just as easily. The older man shook his head in amazement. Whatever he had asked, her answer clearly impressed him. Daniel found himself watching more closely now. He expected to see a waitress helping a guest. Instead, he was witnessing something entirely different. Something that did not fit the assumptions he had unconsciously made about the people working in his restaurant. And as Michael and Jasmine continued their conversation with remarkable fluency, Daniel slowly set aside the business proposal in front of him. Because for the first time that evening, something far more interesting was happening inside his restaurant. Daniel could no longer focus on the investors sitting across from him. Their presentation continued. Charts and projections spread across the table, but his attention remained fixed on the conversation unfolding near the entrance. Jasmine and Michael were still communicating with remarkable ease. What surprised him was not simply that she knew American Sign Language. It was the level of sophistication. Their exchange carried the rhythm of two highly educated people discussing ideas, not a few memorized phrases used to assist a customer. Michael signed something lengthy. Jasmine responded immediately. Then she clarified a point. Michael laughed and signed back. Several employees exchanged confused looks. One server quietly whispered to another. Neither could believe what they were witnessing. Eventually, Jasmine guided Michael toward a quieter table near a window overlooking the city. The older man seemed genuinely relieved. Before sitting down, he signed another question. Jasmine answered. Michael's eyebrows rose noticeably. He signed something else, this time with obvious curiosity. Jasmine nodded. The conversation continued for nearly another minute. Daniel finally excused himself from the investors. I will be back shortly, he said. One of the investors glanced toward the entrance. Everything okay? Daniel followed his gaze. That is exactly what I am trying to figure out. He crossed the dining room slowly. As he approached, Michael was already seated and Jasmine was preparing to take his order. Daniel remained several feet away, not wanting to interrupt. But he listened carefully, not to words, to reactions. Michael looked increasingly impressed with every exchange. Finally, the older man signed a question that caused Jasmine to pause for a moment. Then she answered with a detailed response. Michael leaned back in his chair and smiled with open admiration. When Jasmine finished taking the order and turned to leave, Michael gently touched his chest before signing something to her. Jasmine smiled warmly and signed a reply before heading toward the kitchen. Daniel stepped forward. Excuse me, sir. Michael looked up. Daniel introduced himself and explained that he owned the restaurant. Michael recognized the name immediately. Daniel hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind. May I ask what you and Jasmine were discussing? Michael smiled. Then he reached for a pen and wrote on a napkin. Daniel watched as the older man carefully formed each sentence. When he finished, he handed the napkin over. Daniel read it. His eyes widened. The note said, Your waitress is communicating in advanced ASL. Not conversational. Professional level. Daniel looked up. Michael wrote another sentence beneath the first. I spent 30 years teaching language studies at the university level. I know expertise when I see it. Daniel stared at the note. For a moment, he wondered whether there had been some misunderstanding. A waitress with professional-level sign language skills? The idea seemed impossible only because nobody had ever mentioned it. Michael smiled and continued writing. Then came the sentence that truly captured Daniel's attention. She did not just make communication easier. She made me feel welcome. Daniel looked across the restaurant. Jasmine was already back at work carrying a tray of drinks. Other customers waved for assistance. Another table needed service. She moved through the dining room exactly as she had before. Calm, professional, invisible to most people. Yet Daniel suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Hundreds of employees worked for his company. Thousands. Across the country. And somehow one of the most remarkable people in the building had been standing in front of him for years without him ever noticing. Daniel returned to the investors' table, but his thoughts remained elsewhere. The presentation continued. Revenue forecasts appeared on screens. Growth projections were discussed. Numbers filled the conversation. Yet every few minutes his eyes drifted across the dining room, toward Jasmine. She moved from table to table with the same professionalism she had always displayed. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had just impressed a former university professor with advanced language skills. She simply continued working. That detail fascinated him more than the skill itself. Most people possess talents. Far fewer carried them with such humility. Meanwhile, Michael sat comfortably near the window, enjoying his meal. Several times throughout the evening, Jasmine stopped by his table. Each interaction evolved into a fluid exchange of signs. The conversations were clearly complex. Occasionally Michael laughed. Other times he nodded thoughtfully. More than once he appeared genuinely amazed. Eventually Daniel excused himself from the investors again. This time he approached Michael's table directly. Michael greeted him with a warm smile. Daniel took a seat for a moment and handed him a notepad. The older man understood immediately. Daniel wrote a question. Is she really that good? Michael read the words and smiled. Then he began writing. Daniel watched carefully. When the note was finished, he picked it up. The first sentence immediately caught his attention. She is one of the most naturally fluent signers I have met outside professional interpreting circles. Daniel read the line twice. Michael continued writing beneath it. Most hearing people learn signs. She thinks in the language. Daniel looked up. Michael nodded firmly. Then he added another sentence. There is a difference. Daniel understood enough about communication to recognize the importance of that distinction. Someone who memorized phrases could help with simple interactions. Someone who thought in the language possessed a completely different level of mastery. Across the room, Jasmine was helping a family celebrate a birthday. She smiled as she refilled drinks and delivered desserts. To every customer around her, she appeared to be an ordinary waitress performing her job exceptionally well. Yet Daniel now saw something else. Hidden expertise, hidden dedication, hidden discipline. Michael wrote another note. You should ask her how she learned. Daniel folded the paper thoughtfully. Before he could respond, Michael added one final sentence. I do not think the answer is what you expect. Those words stayed with Daniel long after he returned to the investors. The meeting finally ended nearly an hour later. Contracts were discussed. Handshakes were exchanged. The guests gradually departed. The dinner rush began to slow. Chairs emptied. Conversations softened. Staff members started preparing for the later portion of the evening. Daniel remained behind. He stood near the bar observing the restaurant floor. Jasmine continued working exactly as before. Not once did she seek recognition. Not once did she mention what had happened. In fact, several newer employees still seemed completely unaware of the remarkable conversation she had shared with Michael. Daniel found that increasingly remarkable. In many industries, people advertised every accomplishment. Jasmine appeared determined to hide hers. Near closing time, Michael prepared to leave. Before walking out, he stopped beside Daniel and handed him one final handwritten note. Daniel unfolded it carefully. The message was short. Talent is impressive. Making people feel included is rare. Daniel looked toward Jasmine one more time. At that exact moment, she was helping an elderly customer gather a coat and offering directions to another guest. Small acts. Quiet acts. Easy to overlook. Yet suddenly Daniel realized that the most extraordinary thing about Jasmine was not her mastery of American Sign Language. It was that she used it for others without expecting anything in return. And for the first time that night, he found himself wondering not what she could do, but why she had chosen to learn it in the first place. The restaurant finally entered the quieter hours of the evening. Most of the dinner crowd had departed. Staff members moved at a slower pace now, clearing tables and preparing for closing. The energy that had filled the dining room earlier had softened into something calmer. Yet Daniel Whitmore remained unusually focused on one question. Why? Why would a waitress possess such extraordinary fluency in American Sign Language? Why would someone with that level of ability choose to spend years carrying trays and serving dinners without ever mentioning it? The question followed him throughout the evening. Shortly before closing, he found Jasmine organizing silverware near a service station. She looked exactly as she had all night. Calm, professional, unassuming. If he had not witnessed the interaction himself, he never would have guessed she possessed a skill that had impressed a former language professor. Daniel approached. Jasmine noticed him immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Her tone remained respectful but relaxed. Daniel smiled. "You know who I am?" Jasmine laughed softly. "Most employees know who signs the paychecks." Daniel found himself smiling in return. Fair point. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel decided to ask directly, "How long have you known American Sign Language?" Jasmine's expression changed slightly. Not defensive, reflective. She looked down at the silverware in her hands before answering. "My whole life." Daniel blinked. That was not the answer he expected. "Your whole life?" Jasmine nodded. "It was the first language I learned." Daniel stared at her. For several seconds he said nothing. "The first language?" Jasmine placed the utensils aside. A small smile appeared on her face. "My mother is deaf." Suddenly, everything began making sense. Jasmine leaned against the counter and continued. "When I was little, everyone in our house signed. My mother signed. My grandmother signed. My uncles signed. It was normal." Her voice carried warmth now, the warmth people often reveal when speaking about family. "I learned sign language before I learned how to read." Daniel listened carefully. The restaurant seemed quieter than ever. "So when you were growing up?" Jasmine nodded before he finished. "I spent a lot of time helping people communicate." She smiled at the memory. Doctor's appointments, school meetings, grocery stores, banks, everywhere. Daniel suddenly realized what Michael had meant earlier. She did not merely know the language. She had lived it. Jasmine continued. "Most people think accessibility is a special service." She paused. "For my family, it was everyday life." The simplicity of that statement struck Daniel. He thought back to the entrance earlier that evening. The confusion, the awkwardness, the uncertainty. Everyone had treated communication with Michael as a challenge. Jasmine had treated it as a conversation. There was a difference, a profound difference. "Did you ever consider becoming an interpreter?" Daniel asked. Jasmine smiled. "A lot of people ask that." And she looked around the restaurant. Life happened. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only honesty. "My mother became ill a few years ago. I needed stable work. Flexible hours. Something close to home." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood responsibility. He understood sacrifice. Yet somehow hearing it from Jasmine felt different. Michael's words returned to him. "She made me feel welcome." Suddenly Daniel realized that what impressed him most was not her talent. It was the reason behind it. Jasmine had never learned sign language to stand out. She learned it because she loved someone, because family needed her, because helping others communicate had become part of who she was. And as Daniel stood there listening, he began to understand that the most remarkable abilities often grow from ordinary acts of love repeated over many years. Closing time arrived, and the restaurant slowly emptied. The last guests gathered their belongings and stepped into the cool evening air. Chairs were adjusted. Tables were cleaned. Soft music continued playing through the speakers while employees completed their final tasks. Most nights followed a predictable rhythm. Tonight felt different. Word about Jasmine's interaction with Michael had quietly spread among the staff. Servers whispered about it while rolling silverware. Hosts discussed it near the front desk. Even the kitchen staff had heard fragments of the story. Yet Jasmine behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. She simply continued working. Daniel noticed that. The more he learned about her, the more unusual she seemed. Not because she wanted attention, because she appeared completely uninterested in it. Near the end of the shift, Daniel found himself standing beside a window overlooking the city. The lights of downtown shimmered against the darkness. He thought about the conversation they had shared. A child growing up in a family where sign language was part of everyday life. Years spent helping people communicate. Years spent quietly serving as a bridge between different worlds. There was something profoundly human about that story. A few minutes later, Michael unexpectedly returned. He had forgotten his portfolio at the table near the window. One of the hosts retrieved it immediately. Before leaving again, Michael spotted Daniel and walked over. The older man smiled and pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He handed it to Daniel. Curious, Daniel unfolded it. Inside was another handwritten note. This one was longer. Daniel began reading. The first sentence immediately captured his attention. You should know something about your employee. Daniel continued. Michael explained that during their conversation, he had casually asked Jasmine about recent developments in accessibility standards for deaf customers. He expected a general answer. Instead, Jasmine discussed federal accessibility recommendations, communication best practices, and customer inclusion strategies with remarkable accuracy. Daniel looked up in surprise. Michael nodded. Then he pointed to the note, encouraging him to continue reading. The next section stunned him even more. According to Michael, Jasmine understood many of the same concepts taught in advanced training programs for hospitality accessibility. Yet she had never mentioned it, never requested recognition, never advertised her knowledge. Daniel folded the paper slowly. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Michael smiled and reached for the notepad on the host's stand. His answer appeared a few moments later. Because people often confuse position with value. Daniel stared at the sentence. Michael continued writing. Some of the most capable people in a building are rarely the ones sitting in the biggest offices. The words landed heavily. Daniel thought about his own career. How many times had he evaluated people based on titles, resumes, or positions? How many talented individuals had he overlooked because they occupied roles others considered ordinary? Across the restaurant, Jasmine laughed softly while helping another employee finish cleaning a section. She looked completely unaware of the conversation taking place. Michael wrote one final message. Then he handed the notepad over. Daniel read the sentence twice. She is not extraordinary because she knows sign language. She is extraordinary because she uses it to make strangers feel respected. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Michael shook Daniel's hand and prepared to leave. As the door closed behind him, the restaurant fell quiet. Daniel looked around the nearly empty dining room. Employees finished their final tasks. Lights dimmed gradually. Another business day was ending. Yet Daniel knew something important had shifted. What began as an awkward misunderstanding at the front entrance had revealed far more than hidden talent. It had revealed character. And in Daniel's experience, character was far rarer than skill. The realization stayed with him as he watched Jasmine finish her shift, unaware that the most important chapter of this story had not yet begun. The following morning, Daniel arrived at corporate headquarters carrying something unusual. Not a contract, not a financial report, not an acquisition proposal. He carried questions. The previous evening refused to leave his mind. During breakfast, he found himself thinking about Jasmine. During meetings, he found himself thinking about Michael's notes. Even while reviewing quarterly performance reports, his thoughts kept returning to the same realization. An employee with extraordinary knowledge and empathy had spent years inside his organization without anyone recognizing the full extent of her contribution. By mid-morning, curiosity turned into action. Daniel contacted the regional operations director and requested internal records related to customer accessibility initiatives across the company. The director seemed surprised by the request, but complied immediately. Several reports arrived within the hour. Daniel reviewed them carefully. What he discovered surprised him. Multiple restaurant locations had received positive customer comments over the past 2 years regarding accommodations for deaf guests. Several mentions specifically praised communication support and inclusive service practices. Daniel continued reading. One recurring detail appeared throughout the reports. Employees at the flagship restaurant frequently assisted other team members when accessibility questions arose. Training suggestions had occasionally been shared internally. Recommendations had circulated between managers. Yet nowhere did anyone receive official credit. Daniel frowned. He requested additional records. This time he found emails. Dozens of them. Many included practical suggestions for serving guests with hearing impairments. Others contained recommendations for clearer visual communication. Several offered solutions for making customers feel more comfortable during visits. Most carried the same signature at the bottom. Jasmine Turner. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The realization settled heavily on him. She had not simply helped one guest. She had been quietly improving the customer experience for years. No formal title, no special position, no recognition, just consistent effort. Later that afternoon, he visited the restaurant again. The lunch crowd had thinned, leaving the dining room relatively calm. Jasmine was training a newly hired server near the host's stand. Daniel observed from a distance. The interaction immediately caught his attention. A customer approached with questions about menu options. Jasmine answered patiently. Then she turned back to the new employee and explained not only what to do, but why it mattered. The young server listened carefully. When the conversation ended, Daniel approached the manager. "How often does she help train people?" he asked. The manager looked surprised by the question. "All the time." Daniel frowned. Officially, the manager laughed softly. "No, she just does it." That answer somehow made the situation even more remarkable. Throughout the afternoon, Daniel continued asking questions. The answers remained consistent. Jasmine helped coworkers. Jasmine solved problems. Jasmine supported guests. Jasmine shared knowledge. Yet she never asked for recognition. The pattern repeated again and again. Finally, Daniel sat alone in one of the empty dining booths and thought about what he had learned. Most organizations invested heavily in customer service programs. Consultants were hired. Workshops were scheduled. Expensive strategies were developed. Yet one of the most effective ambassadors for inclusion had emerged naturally from lived experience and genuine compassion. Near the end of her shift, Jasmine walked through the dining room, carrying menus. She still seemed completely unaware of the impact she had made. Daniel watched her for several moments. Then he made a decision. Not because she knew sign language. Not because a respected professor had praised her. Because her actions revealed something far more valuable. Character. The kind that improves every environment it enters. And as Jasmine continued helping customers who would never know her story, Daniel realized he was about to take the first step toward changing hers. 3 days later, employees from several Whitmore hospitality locations gathered inside a conference room at the company's regional headquarters. Managers sat beside trainers. Restaurant supervisors reviewed schedules and operational updates. Most assumed they were attending a routine meeting. Nobody expected anything unusual. Jasmine certainly did not. Earlier that morning, her manager had informed her that corporate leadership wanted her present for a discussion regarding customer service initiatives. She arrived wearing a simple professional outfit and took a seat near the back of the room. The setting felt unfamiliar. Most of her work happened on restaurant floors, not inside conference centers. Around her, people spoke quietly while waiting for the meeting to begin. Then Daniel Whitmore entered. Conversations immediately stopped. He greeted everyone warmly before walking to the front of the room. Jasmine expected the usual business presentation. Growth plans, company updates, performance metrics. Instead, Daniel began speaking about something entirely different. He talked about hospitality. He talked about inclusion. He talked about the difference between serving customers and making people feel welcome. The room listened carefully. Then Daniel shared a story. He described a guest who entered one of the company's restaurants and struggled to communicate. He described employees trying to help. He described confusion, discomfort, missed opportunities. Several managers nodded knowingly. Situations like that happen more often than people realized. Then Daniel described one employee stepping forward. Someone who solved the problem not because she was instructed to, but because she cared. Jasmine slowly realized where the story was heading. Her eyes widened slightly. Around the room, people began looking toward her. Daniel continued. He spoke about hidden talent, hidden contributions, hidden leadership. He described how extraordinary value often exists in places organizations forget to look. The room remained completely silent. Then Daniel invited someone to join him at the front. The conference room doors opened. Michael Reed walked inside. Surprise spread across the audience immediately. Jasmine looked genuinely shocked. She had not seen him since the evening at the restaurant. Michael smiled warmly and approached the podium. An interpreter stood beside him, but Michael also signed directly as he spoke. His hands moved confidently. His expression carried sincerity. He explained how he had visited countless restaurants throughout the country. Some provided good service. Others provided efficient service. Very few provided dignity. The room grew even quieter. Then Michael looked directly at Jasmine. Through both sign language and interpretation, he shared the sentence that had stayed with him since that evening. She did not make me feel accommodated. She made me feel included. No applause followed immediately. The words were too powerful, too personal. For a moment, people simply absorbed them. Several employees lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Others nodded. Jasmine herself appeared overwhelmed. Daniel stepped forward again. He explained that over the previous days he had reviewed reports, emails, and employee feedback. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. Jasmine consistently improved experiences for guests and coworkers without seeking recognition. She trained others, solved problems, shared knowledge, built connections. Most importantly, she treated people with respect. Daniel looked around the room before speaking his next words. Talent matters, but character multiplies the value of talent. The audience erupted into applause. Not polite applause, genuine applause. The kind earned through admiration. Jasmine sat frozen for a moment, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Yet as the room continued applauding, something remarkable happened. Dozens of employees saw her differently. Not as a waitress, not as a job title, but as a person whose quiet actions had improved the lives of people around her for years. And Daniel knew the most important part of this story was still waiting to be told. The applause gradually faded, but the atmosphere inside the conference room remained changed. People were no longer looking at Jasmine with casual familiarity. They were looking at her with respect. Not because she had become someone different, because they had finally seen who she had been all along. Jasmine sat quietly, clearly overwhelmed by the attention. For years she had focused on helping people, not standing in front of them. Recognition had never been her goal. Yet the room understood something important now. Exceptional character often works silently. Daniel waited until the room settled before speaking again. There is one more thing. The audience turned their attention back to him. Daniel smiled toward Jasmine. Over the past week, I have learned a great deal about talent. But I have learned even more about service. He paused. Service is not carrying a tray. Service is helping people feel that they belong. Several employees nodded. The words resonated because they had witnessed the story unfold. Daniel continued. He announced the creation of a new accessibility and guest inclusion initiative across the entire Whitmore hospitality organization. The program would help employees better serve guests with hearing impairments and other communication needs. Then he revealed something nobody expected. Jasmine would help design the program. A wave of surprise moved through the room. Jasmine looked genuinely stunned. Daniel smiled. You have already been doing this work unofficially for years. It is time we recognize it. The applause returned, louder than before. Jasmine slowly stood. For a moment she seemed unsure what to say. Then she looked around the room. She saw managers, servers, hosts, executives, people from different departments and different backgrounds. Finally she spoke. Her voice was calm, just as it had been the night she approached Michael at the restaurant entrance. I do not think people need special treatment. The room grew quiet. I think people need to feel seen. The simplicity of the statement carried enormous weight. Jasmine continued. Most of us remember moments when someone took time to understand us. Those moments stay with us. Michael smiled from the front row. He understood exactly what she meant. Daniel did too, because that was what had happened in the restaurant. A guest arrived expecting another difficult experience. Instead, he encountered understanding. Not because a company policy required it, because a person cared enough to connect. After the meeting ended, employees gathered around Jasmine. Many thanked her. Others shared stories about family members with hearing impairments. Several admitted they wanted to learn sign language themselves. The conversations continued long after the formal event concluded. Something meaningful had begun. Later that afternoon, as the building gradually emptied, Michael approached Jasmine one final time. Through sign language, he thanked her again. Then he signed a sentence she would never forget. You changed the room before you ever entered it. Jasmine smiled, touched by the words. Nearby, Daniel watched the exchange. He thought back to the evening when Michael had almost walked out of the restaurant unnoticed. One small act had changed everything. Not because it was dramatic, because it was human. Years later, many employees would remember the accessibility initiative. Many guests would benefit from the changes it inspired. But the lesson people remembered most was far simpler. Talent can impress a crowd. Knowledge can earn admiration. Success can attract attention. Yet the qualities that truly transform lives are empathy, dignity, and the willingness to make another person feel welcome. Jasmine never set out to impress a billionaire CEO. She never intended to become an example for an entire company. She simply treated someone with respect. And in doing so, she reminded everyone around her of a truth that is easy to forget. The people we overlook today may be the very people who teach us what greatness really looks like.